The Panzer IV's 75mm gun kicked against frozen steel. Heinz Guderian watched his own doctrine devour itself through the scope of a Zeiss rangefinder. October 1942. He had preached for years that the tank's engine was a weapon just as deadly as its main gun. Now those engines were seizing solid at minus 36 degrees Celsius. No special low-temperature oil. The quartermasters hadn't listened. Klotzen, Nick Kleckern, Guderian muttered, "Boot them, don't spatter them." The irony tasted like cordite and diesel fumes. He'd built the Panzerwaffe on a single truth: movement was life. Speed was everything. The French campaign in 1940 had proven it. The Char B tanks the French fielded carried superior armor, superior firepower. On paper, they should have torn the Wehrmacht apart. But French armor sat still. German armor moved. That was the difference. That was the revolution. Guderian's Panzer I and II models were death traps the moment they stopped rolling. They survived by never stopping. Strike fast. Exploit the gap. Never consolidate. Keep moving before the enemy could react. Now his tanks couldn't move at all. The Karabiner 98, K's 7.92mm rounds cracked against concrete somewhere ahead. Stalingrad's tractor factory stretched across the horizon like a steel graveyard. 8 kilometers of industrial hell that had swallowed entire divisions. Movement had collapsed to 8 kilometers per day through rubble-choked streets. Guderian's revolution had run headfirst into a wall of Soviet brick and blood, and the wall was winning. Soviet Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov crouched behind the factory's main assembly line. He'd been fighting in this building for 2 weeks, and he'd memorized every corner, every shadow, every echo. The German doctrine terrified him, not the tanks themselves. He'd watched T-34s burn often enough to lose his fear of fire. What terrified him was the coordination. Every German panzer carried wireless radio per Guderian's insistence. They moved like a single organism. Wolf packs with steel teeth. The MG-34's distinctive ripping chatter tore through metal sheeting like fabric. That sound alone made men break. When the Stukas arrived, their sirens drove boys to madness before a single bomb dropped. Shell concussion hit your chest like a sledgehammer. Vision blurred, lungs forgot how to work. Guderian had weaponized terror itself, and it was working. But the factory was changing the equation. The 389th Infantry Division had pounded the tractor factory complex with 30 minutes of concentrated artillery at 0600 hours on October 14th. Then the real work began. Hauptmann Miller counted 130 men in his company before the whistle blew. Veteran grenadiers, men who knew their business, extra bandages tucked into webbing. Nobody talked about going home. The first 100 meters felt like victory. Boots crunched through brick dust. Factory walls loomed closer. Then the machine guns opened up. The MG-34s answered with their own chatter. Tracers carved red lines through the smoke. Then Soviet fire came from directions that made no sense. From below. From behind cleared rooms. From positions the Germans had walked through an hour earlier. Movement slowed to a crawl. Grenadier units spent entire days clawing through debris that used to be buildings. The Karabiner 98K became nearly useless in close quarters. The 7.92mm rounds overpenetrated, punching through walls and wasting energy on concrete. The MG-34's distinctive sound gave away German positions to Soviet snipers with Mosin Nagant rifles. Every cleared room bred new enemies from the tunnel systems running beneath the factory floor. Death lurked behind every lathe and machine tool. One company entered the tractor factory complex with 130 men on October 14th. 11 survivors walked out on October 28th. The numbers carved themselves into Guderian's skull. His doctrine demanded mobility, breakthrough, exploitation, not this grinding block by block, slaughter. It is sometimes tougher to fight my superiors than the French, he told his staff. Hitler's Stalingrad directive demanded tactical impossibilities, fixed positions, static defense, everything that murdered tanks, everything that murdered men. Guderian wasn't the only one doing arithmetic. The 14th Panzer Division bled strength by the hour. The Soviet 13th Tank Corps had fielded 157 machines in August, 94 T-34s and 63 T-70. Within 6 days of intense combat, 326 tanks had been destroyed across both sides. But here was the brutal number hidden inside that statistic. 200 of those machines died from mechanical breakdown. Not enemy fire, not German anti-tank guns, not Panzerfaust, internal failure. The machines ate themselves before the enemy could touch them. In the cramped turret of a T-34, Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Volkov watched the German armor advance across the steppe through vision blocks clouded with grime. The Panthers looked magnificent, terrifying. Long 75mm guns, sloped armor that could deflect Soviet shells at range. On paper, they were everything the T-34 wasn't, but his gunner had spotted the telltale smoke trails. "Comrade Lieutenant, half their tanks are breaking down before we fire a shot." The radio crackled with German voices, panic bleeding through the frequencies. Main drive failure, transmission seized, requesting recovery vehicle. Volkov smiled grimly. His crude T-34 kept running while German precision engineering ate itself alive. The Panthers had been rushed to Kursk before their mechanical problems were resolved. 200 of them rolled into battle. 43 remained operational after the initial fighting. Not from Soviet fire. Transmissions seized. Final drives cracked. The Wehrmacht's wonder weapons destroyed themselves trying to move. But the factory was the real education. Inside the tractor factory's cavernous halls, Obergefreiter Klaus Weber pressed his back against a cold, concrete pillar and counted his ammunition. His company had started October with 130 men. The math was simple. Subtract bodies, carry fear. 3 hours past midnight. The factory floor stretched into absolute darkness. Lathes and machine tools created a maze that swallowed sound and light equally. Weber's hands shook, not from cold, from what came after the quiet. The silence before contact was worse than contact itself. It gave your mind room to calculate odds. 17 meters between MG-34 gun crews. Too far, and everyone knew it. The Soviets knew it. They had been counting German muzzle flashes like coins, mapping every position, memorizing every gap. The MP-34 rattled somewhere deep in the darkness. Short burst, then silence. Weber counted heartbeats. Senior Lieutenant Pavel Volkov had been crawling through drainage pipes for 6 hours. His PPSH submachine gun scraped against concrete with every meter. The Germans thought they had cleared this sector yesterday. They were wrong. The factory had been built by Soviet workers. Every pipe, every foundation, every hiding place was carved from childhood memory. Volkov had worked in a factory like this before the war. He knew things no German map could show. He emerged behind a massive lathe and listened to German voices carrying across the floor. Frightened whispers. Good. Fear was the first weapon. His DP-27 light machine gun team waited in the tunnel mouth for the signal. The signal came as 3 short whistle blasts. The DP-27 opened up from the tunnel mouth. Muzzle flashes strobed across the factory floor like lightning. German positions revealed themselves through return fire, exactly as planned. Soviet infantry flowed between the machines, not charging, infiltrating, moving like water finding cracks. The cleared sector had never been cleared. It was bait. Weber saw them now, dark shapes materializing from shadows he'd walked past an hour ago. He fired. The recoil jarred his frozen shoulder. 3 rounds left in the magazine. He reached for another clip and found empty webbing. The factory stretched forever ahead. Production lines had become killing fields. Quality control booths had become sniper nests. The machinery that built tractors now manufactured corpses. His breath formed crystals in the air, minus 12 degrees inside the building. The oil in his rifle would freeze by dawn. The silence had grown teeth, and it had found them. Hauptmann Müller's company wasn't alone in these statistics. Across the entire Stalingrad pocket, the Wehrmacht was discovering the hard limit of Blitzkrieg doctrine. Panzer IVs couldn't penetrate the rubble maze. Their 75mm guns fired blindly into walls and concrete. Radio communications fractured in the metallic cavern of the factory halls. The very industrial environment that had made Germany strong as a manufacturing nation was now being used against German soldiers as a weapon. How many left, Feldwebel? 42, sir. Maybe 40. That was day 7. Day 14. Müller stood in the ruins with 11 men. The tractor factory technically belonged to the Wehrmacht. Sort of. The Soviets still held the basements, and the eastern wing, and probably the roof. Then Soviet artillery opened up from a different direction. The counterattack was coming. Müller checked his ammunition. 15 rounds. The thermometer read minus 36 Celsius when Obergefreiter Hans Müller found them at dawn. 3 sentries, still standing. Carabiner 98K rifles clutched in frozen grips. Eyes staring across the steppe like glass marbles. Ice crystals formed halos around their mouths, where final breaths had crystallized into the morning air. He pried the rifle from the first corpse. The metal stuck to the dead man's palm, leaving strips of frozen flesh on the trigger guard. Behind him, Panzer IV engines wouldn't turn over. No low-temperature oil. The Wehrmacht's 75mm guns sat silent as tombstones. 8 kilometers east, Lieutenant Vasily Chwikov watched the sunrise paint the Volga red. His men huddled around barrel fires, burning factory blueprints for warmth. The DP-27 machine gun beside him had seized twice in the night. Ice locked the 7.62mm feed mechanism solid. His sergeant's feet had swollen black inside his boots, frostbite turning flesh into grotesque balloons. But they weren't retreating, couldn't retreat. The river ice wouldn't hold their weight, and the Germans controlled every street behind them. The Volga had become their enemy too. Trapped between German steel and Russian winter, the Soviet defenders had discovered something unexpected about their own psychology. When escape becomes impossible, something changes in a man. The calculus of survival shifts. You stop spending energy on the thought of survival and spend it all on the thought of cost. How much will they pay to take this ground? How expensive can I make my death? Through iron sights, Chwikov watched 12 Wehrmacht soldiers stumble through. The rubble, their movements jerky, mechanical, like the frozen dead still walking. Hauptmann Ernst Becker pressed his face against frozen concrete and watched shadows move between the machinery. His MP-34 felt like lead in numb fingers. Mein Gott, he whispered to his Feldwebel. They're not retreating anymore. Soviet soldiers emerged from bomb craters like wraiths, faces blackened by frostbite and cordite, eyes reflecting something Becker had never seen in French prisoners or Polish civilians, complete absence of fear. Men with nothing left to lose moved differently than men fighting for their lives. They moved through twisted steel like water, PPSH, submachine guns chattering in short, disciplined bursts. Herr Hauptmann, his radio man's voice cracked. They're in the tunnels again. Becker closed his eyes. Every cleared room bred new enemies. Areas secured hours ago now held Soviet defenders who had materialized from underground. A grenade detonated 30 meters east. The concussion struck his chest like a hammer. Vision blurred. Machine gun fire ripped through the air like tearing canvas. Someone screamed in Russian, then German, then silence. Somewhere in the ruins, more sentries would freeze standing upright tonight. Tomorrow, their comrades would find them clutching useless rifles, staring at an enemy that refused to die. The T-34s rolled off the red October assembly line with coffee stains on the driver's seat. Cigarette butts rattled in the turret corners. No paint, no optics. Raw steel driving straight into the meat grinder. The factory workers had been building tanks with one hand and holding rifles with the other. German shells were landing in the factory parking lot while they torqued the final bolts. The transmission oil was still warm when these machines hit the battlefield. Workers' fingerprints still on the firing controls. Cigarette stubs still in the crew compartments. Production hadn't stopped. It had simply relocated its delivery. Point to the front line. From the German side, watching these unpainted monsters emerge from the smoke was like watching ghosts made of steel. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter crouched behind his disabled Panzer IV, its gun pointed uselessly at the sky. The approaching T-34s moved differently than the machines he'd faced before. These were rough, desperate. The sound of their V2 diesel engines was uneven, grinding like wounded animals. Through his field glasses, he could see the lead tank's driver's hatch was still open. The crew were probably choking on exhaust fumes from an improperly sealed system. But they kept coming. The terror wasn't in their precision. It was in their complete disregard for reliability, for doctrine, for their own survival. When the first T-34 threw a track at 400 meters, and the crew bailed out, still firing their PPSH submachine guns on the way down, Richter understood what he was actually looking at. The Soviets had weaponized their own industrial. Desperation. The numbers told the real story. 12 Soviet tank brigades burned through 326 tanks in 6 days. Only 126 fell to German anti-tank guns or Panzerfaust. 200 died from mechanical failure, seized transmissions, thrown tracks, engine fires from contaminated fuel. The DP-27 machine guns mounted on turrets jammed from factory metal shavings still in the receivers. "Comrade Lieutenant, the clutch is gone. Keep driving. The engine is overheating. Keep driving. The main gun won't traverse. Ram them." Stalin's accountants had done the math. A T-34 cost 269,500 rubles. A trained tank crew cost 180,000 rubles. Retreating cost the war. The forbidden calculation was simple arithmetic dressed up as heroism. German mechanics needed 14 hours of maintenance for every hour of combat their panzers performed. Soviet mechanics needed 30 minutes of welding and a fresh crew. Quality control had become a luxury the Red Army couldn't afford, so they had abandoned the war concept entirely and replaced it with sheer volume. The Wehrmacht was not fighting an army. It was fighting an industrial process. Every destroyed T-34 was replaced by 2 more that might not make it past the factory gates, but would die trying. The Movin Nagant rifles issued to replacement crews still had wood shavings in the barrel grooves. The 7.62mm ammunition was loaded with powder that burned too fast, splitting cartridge cases and jamming actions at the worst moments. It didn't matter. The factory workers went back to their lathes between artillery barrages. Coffee got cold. Cigarettes burned down to ash. Steel kept moving toward German lines. Christmas Eve, 1942. The tractor factory district still reeked of cordite and blood 13 days after the initial assault. Lieutenant Muller's voice carried across the factory ruins to Major von Lossau's position. "The Russians are sitting in my trench." The words came out broken, exhausted. A man at the end of his rope reporting an impossible situation with the hollow professionalism of a soldier who has long since stopped being surprised by anything. Two shapes moved in the rubble, children, boys no older than 13. Soviet scouts trained to identify German telephone hubs and tactical markers. Weapons in a war where innocence had become ammunition. Muller raised the carabiner. The first shot dropped the smaller boy. The second round jammed. Ice crystals in the firing pin assembly. From the Soviet position, Senior Lieutenant Kozlov watched the German struggle with his rifle. He could see the man's breath coming in short, visible puffs. Panic made visible in the cold air. Kozlov had watched these Germans in the factory fighting. They had expected quick victories, clean warfare. The kind of war their doctrine had delivered in France and Poland and the open steppe of Russia's early summer. Not this grinding horror where children died as combatants, and the ground itself seemed to resist every inch of advance. The MG-34 opened up from the German strongpoint. That familiar fabric-ripping sound cut through the morning air. The surviving Soviet boy crawled deeper into the rubble maze. Von Lossau reached Muller's position, Luger drawn. "Where are they?" "Tunnel system, under the lathe section." Muller's voice cracked. "They've been there all night, listening." The second boy appeared, moving through the machinery with trained precision. Von Lossau's Luger barked twice. The child dropped beside a frozen German sentry, a man who had died standing at his post during night watch. Two bodies side by side on Christmas Eve. One killed by cold, one killed by a 9mm round. Both equally still. "Merry Christmas, Major." Muller's voice carried no irony anymore, just exhaustion. Von Lossau stared at the dead children, 13 years old. The Volga stretched behind Soviet lines, ice-choked and impassable. Every Soviet soldier in this city had nowhere to go. That was the point. That had always been the point. Machine gun fire echoed across the ruins, fabric tearing, metal on metal. The sound of Christmas morning in Stalingrad. Lieutenant General Alexander von Daniel sat in Soviet custody, his Wehrmacht tunic torn, his bearing still military, still precise, even here, especially here. When a German general maintains his composure in a Soviet interrogation room, it is the last weapon available to him. Your encirclement operation was a strategic masterpiece, he told his interrogator without prompting. The Soviet officer leaned forward. "You pushed us to the riverbank," Daniel continued. "We thought we had you trapped. We were wrong." The tractor factory assault began at 0600 hours, October 14th, 30 minutes of artillery. The 389th Infantry Division moved first. The 14th Panzer Division followed through the gaps, and the rubble swallowed them both. 130 men at dawn, 11 survivors by October 28th. The mathematics of annihilation written in German: blood. 8 kilometers through Stalingrad's ruins. 1 full day to cross that distance. The Karabiner 98K that had served German infantry across half of Europe became useless in close quarters. The 7.9 2mm rounds punched through walls but couldn't punch through Soviet determination. The MG-34 overheated, jammed, failed. Even German mechanical excellence broke down inside Stalingrad. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov crouched behind a lathe in the Red October factory, listening to German voices echo through the workshops. "They sound different now," he whispered to his radio man. "Desperate." The Panzer IV rolled between the factory buildings, its 75mm gun swiveling left and right. The T-34s were gone, knocked out or broken down. The DP-27 rattled from the second floor. German infantry scattered. But they kept coming. They always kept coming. That was the terrifying thing about the Germans. They kept coming even when the math told them they should stop. Temperature dropped to minus 36. Sentries froze at their posts, standing dead. The Wehrmacht had no low-temperature oil. Vehicles seized. The mechanical reality of a Russian winter consuming German steel with methodical, indifferent efficiency. The forbidden tactic, Daniel told his interrogator, was accepting what we refused to accept. The Soviet soldier at the Volga's edge fought differently than any soldier the Wehrmacht had faced before. Death waited behind him in the form of Black River ice. Death waited in front in the form of German steel. When the choice simplified to those two options, something fundamental changed in a man. The PPSH submachine gun became an extension of will rather than a tool of survival. No retreat possible, no retreat necessary. No energy spent on the thought of escape, because escape had been removed from the equation entirely. 13 days to clear the tractor factory district. 13 days for what German planning had estimated would take 13 hours. Soviet soldiers emerged from tunnels after areas were cleared. Every machine tool concealed a sniper. Every conveyor belt hid a grenade. The cleared ground was never truly cleared. It was occupied territory that could be reclaimed from below at any hour. The ripping sound of machine gun fire. The chest-striking concussion of artillery. Vision blurring under shell impact. German letters home described Verdun with new weapons. They described fighting uphill in every direction simultaneously against an enemy that couldn't be killed because the city itself kept producing more of them. Your strategic masterpiece, Daniel concluded, looking at his Soviet interrogator with something approaching professional respect, was understanding that cornered men don't surrender. They transform. The Volga flowed behind every Soviet position. The river that should have been a trap became a wall. And walls, as the Germans had discovered at enormous cost in blood and steel, can be fought from. A man with a wall at his back doesn't have to worry about what's behind him. He only has to worry about what's in front. Guderian had preached klotzen, nicht kleckern. Boot them, don't spatter them. Strike with concentrated force. Keep moving, never stop. But his boots were frozen to the ground outside Stalingrad. His panthers were breaking their own transmissions trying to move, and his doctrine was bleeding out in the rubble one company at a time. The engine of the Panzer was a weapon just as the main gun. He'd been right about that. But the city was a weapon too. The rubble was a weapon. The tunnel system was a weapon. The Volga at your back was a weapon. The cold was a weapon. The Soviet capacity to absorb loss and continue was a weapon that no German doctrine had accounted for, because no German planner had seriously entertained the possibility that the Soviet Union could absorb this much punishment and remain coherent. 200 Panthers destroyed themselves at Kursk before Soviet shells touched them. The 14th Panzer Division bled to 11 survivors in 14 days. 3 sentries froze upright on Christmas Eve. 13-year-old boys died in drainage pipes under a tractor factory. These were the numbers that Guderian's doctrine had produced when it met the specific gravity of Stalingrad. The Wehrmacht had expected a campaign. It got an education. Inside the pocket, German soldiers wrote letters that the censors stopped reading because they could no longer bear to catalog what they described. Men spoke of the cold as if it were a living enemy, patient and methodical in a way that Soviet soldiers were not. The cold didn't sleep. The cold didn't need ammunition. The cold didn't need to be relieved after 14 days in the line. It simply waited, and it was better at waiting than any German soldier in any position along the front. Meanwhile, Soviet factory workers torqued bolts while artillery landed in the parking lot. They drank cold coffee between shifts. They went back to their lathes when the barrage lifted. They sent tanks to the front line with cigarette stubs still in the crew compartments because there was no time to clean them, and cleaning them had never been the point. The point was to produce. The point was to keep moving steel toward German lines faster than German fire could stop it. The forbidden tactic wasn't a military maneuver. It was a psychological state. It was what happened when a defender ran out of options and discovered that having no options was, paradoxically, a form of freedom. You couldn't be outmaneuvered when you had nowhere to maneuver. You couldn't be flanked when you held nothing worth flanking. You could only be killed, and you had already made your peace with that possibility weeks ago. Guderian understood doctrine. He understood engines and armor and the geometry of breakthrough. He understood wireless coordination and the psychology of speed. What he didn't understand, what the entire Wehrmacht general staff failed to understand until Stalingrad rubbed their faces in it, was what a defender became when the defender had nothing left to lose. The Volga flowed behind every Soviet position, black and cold and impassable. It was not an obstacle, it was an answer. The river said, "This far and no further." The river said, "There is nowhere to run, so stop thinking about running." The river said, "The only direction left is forward," and forward means directly into the barrel of whatever German weapon is in front of you right now. So pick up your PPSH and move. Lieutenant General von Daniel looked at his Soviet interrogator across the table in the interrogation room and delivered his analysis with the precision of a man who had spent his career studying war and had finally learned something his career hadn't taught him. Cornered men don't surrender, they transform. He was right, and the transformation had destroyed him. Outside, the Volga flowed beneath its skin of ice, carrying spring, toward a war that winter could